Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. I hope you've enjoyed Distributed 2021 so far. My name is Hollis Cool, and I'm a partner marketing manager here at Miro. And today I'm especially excited to introduce Lance Weiler, who is a Miro customer and also founder and director of Columbia University's Digital Storytelling Lab as part of the Columbia University School of the Arts, and is a pioneer in mixed media storytelling and using emerging media and digital technologies. I have had the awesome honor to collaborate with Lance myself on some of the work that you might see today. And so I'm really excited that we can talk today about the way that Lance has really unlocked new ways of using Miro that I've never seen before, and I think is a really great opportunity for creators in this audience, designers, meeting facilitators, anybody that's really thinking about how you're leveling up the way that you're forging creative connection in your meetings in Miro. I think that today's session with Lance is going to be a really neat opportunity to change the way that you're thinking about building an environment in Miro. And so really excited for you to be here today, Lance. Thanks a lot. So I'm just going to hop right in. I'd like to tee things up a little bit, to land people a little bit in the work that you're doing, because I think it's unlike a lot of storytelling and media and art that people have seen and experienced before. And so just to begin, I was thinking we could actually share a clip from some of the work that you've done on one of your projects. So maybe we can start there and watch this clip.
Sure. Nice to meet everybody.
You have one more test to pass. I feel that we can trust each other. I understand your mind. It is a very powerful weapon. Can you connect the stars in the darkness?
So for Miro users out there, many of you may have recognized or maybe didn't recognize that as a Miro board, although maybe altered. So Lance, I'd love if you could just describe a little bit what we were looking at and how that fits into the work that you do in digital storytelling and experience design and the role that Miro plays in your work.
Yeah. Basically, what we do at the lab is we explore new forms and functions of storytelling through using story, design, and play. And we do a lot of work that's highly collaborative with large scale, collaboration with people all over the world. And so what you just saw there is part of a design research project, which is called Project Immerse. It's an immersive learning environment where basically we're using Miro as a way to bring a group of people together in kind of a collective sense-making activity where they're interacting with like 90% of what you saw there was actually made by artificial intelligence. So it's AI in terms of deep fake videos, the text that you see, the images, the script, the music, the way it's edited is all done with AI. And so the piece is really kind of exploring this notion of misinformation and trust in the 21st century. So a lot of the work that we do explores this notion of moving from kind of a one-to-many paradigm to a many-to-many paradigm. So we're very focused on this opportunity of what does storytelling look like in the 21st century when stories spill off screens and into the real world and back, and how can you work with those formerly known as the audience in the sense that the role of storytellers is drastically changing. Like a lot of people in their DNA have this, are storytellers, but the tools to be able to quickly tell stories have been very kind of locked away. It's been very much a hierarchy. So one of the things that I really like about kind of making use of Miro in conjunction as a tool in our practice is the fact that it moves at the speed of creativity, right? It allows us to kind of dive in and start to rapidly prototype works in a way that's very dynamic because, honestly, they wouldn't exist without the participants, right? Like the stories we tell are shaped by the people who step into those experiences.
All of that said, I want to kind of dig into the moment in which you really first discovered Miro as a way to start to tell those stories and to accelerate that thinking. And when we first connected, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I'm curious to know a little bit more about how the pandemic and you as a professor of practice as well at Columbia University, so being in an educational environment, how that maybe accelerated your thoughts around how we can use and push new mediums, and in this case, the medium being Miro, to really facilitate this kind of creative sense making and bringing people together. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, I kind of came across, and I had used Miro a couple different times in the context of like, working with teams, mainly around like design or collaborative kind of work. When it kind of switched for me and the epiphany moment kind of came where I had a physical installation that I had been doing in 2019 at the Tribeca Film Festival, which was set in a storefront where folks would enter and engage in this immersive experience that mixed the Internet of Things and these enchanted objects, and they unlocked stories. And it was a very personal kind of piece that was an immersive kind of documentary meets an escape room meets, kind of this notion of immersive theater. And I had it commissioned and it was going to travel. But when COVID hit, like everything else, things changed. And so I started thinking about ways that I could bring the work to more people and started to think about how I could scale it, and kind of had this epiphany when I was messing around with Miro on a certain thing. I started to think, well, I wonder if I could use this infinite canvas, which I really love, as a way to be able to tell a story. And what if I were to place kind of like these collages that mixed, audio and video and text? Could I allow people to kind of get lost within this board and make sense of it themselves with other people while they're in breakout rooms? And so what was really quite amazing about it was I just started to prototype it. I had the idea and I was like, oh, let's just try it. And so I started to bring it into some virtual meetups that we did around the lab. And I just started to hone it and experiment. And what I loved about it was this notion of being able to, it's like being at a music festival and your friends at a separate stage and you're trying to find each other and you're at like some other area of the festival and you're texting back and forth and you can get lost. And I thought that was really interesting, this idea of combining web pervasive tools like Zoom and Miro and allowing people to make sense of an experience together, that the story happens and unfolds in the moment when they're there. And so, I really liked the ability to rapidly prototype. A lot of the work that I do will take years. We build our own technology for it. And Miro just became this really natural, rapid prototyping tool. And I liked it so much that I started to bring it into the classroom and introduced it throughout the university, not only in the School of the Arts, but through the collaborations that we were doing with other schools there, right? And all of a sudden we were bridging silos. We were collaborating in ways that weren't normal for the university, or the university hadn't collaborated like that before. And it became very dynamic. And now we bring it up all the time and use it, throughout, not only in class, my students will use it all through the semester as a way to kind of track their learning journey through the courses. But we also use it in the way that we manage the lab and the way that we do collaborative work. So it's a win-win in that sense.
Definitely. I think I can resonate as somebody that's collaborated with you and learned about digital storytelling from you. I think to be a user of Miro in the contexts that you've built, I think the work that you've done has really changed the way that we think about engaging with each other during the constraints of a pandemic. And I think a lot of what we hear from teams and facilitators is how are we creating this sense of connection, and how do we transcend the limitations of how we communicate now through just audio and visual cues. And so not only have you managed to do that, but I also find that it's elevating the experience to discovery with other people and actually being able to engage with ideas and to see things in a way that I don't think I would see if I were in person. So that's been my own experience. And so I think it really resonates well with a need right now of when we're collaborating, how do we, and especially on creative problems, how do we have conditions that make us see problems in a new way? And that's kind of like where creation comes from. So I think now I would love to maybe bring us back to the board and start to ground us more in some of your projects, because I think the work that you do is best shown and experienced. And so I'd love to maybe explore, as we're going through the board, how your work in digital storytelling and experience design has taught you about how to use Miro in its most effective forms, and how using Miro has also reciprocally taught you about kind of new creative ways to effectively do storytelling online.
Sure. Well, I think like one thing that's really important, and what we do when we build experiences, we think about the way in which somebody's landing within them. And we'll usually do some type of priming activity. The other side of this that's a real tension sometimes is the onboarding. So how are you actually onboarding somebody? So a lot of times what we do, what you're looking at here, is a way that will kind of narrativize the onboarding process, right? Like in video games, there'll be a practice where all of a sudden you'll come across a rock and you'll realize you can pick it up, and then when you drop it on the ground, it sparks. And you'll think, oh, that's fun, and you'll just keep doing it. But then later in the game, you'll realize, oh, I need to start a fire, and you'll remember how you can actually spark the rock, right? And so a lot of the times it's like looking and saying, how can we find interesting ways to bring people into the board and allow them to interact with it in a way where they're kind of learning about the functionality that they'll use later on in the experience. So here you're seeing some stuff where we're doing really basic things, in terms of how people can zoom, the use of the cursor. We put in a little primer video that shows stuff very quickly, shows them where things are in the board, and then it welcomes them to the project and allows them to kind of, it lets them know what, the steps are that are going to be necessary. For here, it's basically walking them through how to zoom in and out, it's making sure that they understand how to zoom. It's taking them through something that's allowing them to resize. And it's important to note that the things that they're working with are assets that they're going to use later in the experience, but they don't quite know it. Here's something that's all about showing them how to use Post-its that we stylize like a Rorschach, and they start to combine it as a puzzle within it, right? Like, so they're able to kind of move things into this, and they're doing this all in a group. And it's interesting because this happens in a waiting room of Zoom. So they can't even talk to each other, right? So they're collaborating and finding their way through, and you see all the other cursors moving, and it's a very kind of exciting way to initiate an experience. And then as you kind of drop in, it shows you how to play video, how to play an animated GIF, because there's rich media within it, gets into this element of like doing things with Post-it notes to get them familiar with how to use the Post-it notes. And then it brings them into the actual experience, right? Warning, the following simulation was created by artificial intelligence. You will encounter violent themes and disturbing images, right? Like, so it's priming them. This is like a deep fake conspiratorial thriller that they step into, right? And so as they enter this, it drops them. At this point, we kind of come in now, and we've opened the waiting room, and now everybody's falling into Zoom, and they're just greeted by this on their screen. And so we've created Miro as this like window into this world, where all of a sudden they start moving. You see the cursors moving all over, and they have editorial permission, right? So they're able to kind of move through this and uncover different things that are, they're trying to figure out what's real and not, and they're working together to make sense of it. And all within this, they start to uncover a series of crimes, and they're trying to figure out what actually happened in it. So it has a bit of a kind of an escape room thing going on, but a lot of it is really kind of like about their ability to kind of unlayer and layer the truth, right? And so they have the ability to kind of move through all these assets and kind of move them around and try to figure out what they think makes sense. And there's a variety of clues that are kind of placed within it and messages. And so it's really, the whole piece is about apathenia, which is this idea that we look for patterns within things in order to make greater sense of the world around us. We tell ourselves stories with those patterns. And we did a lot of research around QAnon with this project, and how conspiracy theories are shaped and how they grow. So when we're running this, what's really kind of interesting about this too is the fact that this is basically, myself and a team. So we are doing performances with Miro. Not only are people in there, but the whole back end is being organized by a team. So you have the team that's trying to make sense of the board that they find themselves in. And then you have us using it. This is a view of our back end where we have all the assets visually arranged, and we're able to kind of bring them into the board. And we built out a widget that allows us to do some automation. So we can hide things behind layers and then turn them on and move all throughout the board. But we use it even in the backstage to help, organize the actual show itself. So what you're looking at here is all the assets. Some of our boards are quite large. They'll have thousands of pieces in them, right? So like managing that in real time. And our storytelling is very improvisational, right? We watch, and what we love about Miro is we can actually see what's happening. Where are people thriving, or where are they stuck? What are they gravitating towards? And so we become very interested in that idea that the story can ebb and flow based upon what the participants are actually doing, right? That's a fundamental shift in the way stories are told. And so not only is it innovating on the front end in terms of what the storytellers are doing, it's innovating on the way in which these stories are being managed and dispersed by a team. So I want to show another example, right? Like that first one's a deep fake conspiracy thriller. This next one is the virtual version of what is effectively an immersive experience that started in a physical environment. So here what you see is going to be some sped up activity of people actually in the experience. This particular piece is probably the most vulnerable and personal work I've ever made. My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and in his care, we experienced this total lack of empathy at the time when he was getting his diagnosis. But at the same time, I grew up in a firefighting household, and we had 2 devastating fires in my youth, and my dad was an amateur fire scene photographer. So for over 30 years, I wondered if my dad actually set those fires, right? So there's this mystery in here. It's a kind of a story that's about memory, loss, and life. And participants start to move through this landscape together and make sense of it. So what you're seeing here is they're moving through all these fragments, journal entries, videos, home videos, just different documentary things, and there's branching paths. Here you see me using the bring to me, or the attention management feature, where we're weaving in moments where I'm giving a special one-on-one or a little group a special experience within the board as it's happening, right? So that's like an example of an interaction within the board that's quite exciting. And participants are able to move all over. Here's another example where 2 people encounter something and they start to do a role playing. They each choose a different path, and one reads one script and the other reads the other script so they can hear it in the breakout room. This is an example of marrying a simple aesthetic of frustration to an action in the board. Like all of a sudden you realize all the worries that I have are attached to one element. You're able to drag and you see it snap. And here's a moment at the end where people are letting go of something that they chose to save at the beginning. And they're kind of doing that in an activity at the close of the experience. So like the central part of this is happening within Miro, right? Like it's the investigative layer of being able to move through a story with other people, but also reflecting on your own life at the same time. So what I have found with this is it's an incredibly interesting way to structure learning environments, because it kind of works to kind of shift what is the perspective, right? Like it allows people to be able to see, potentially a different perspective than they might otherwise, right? Which is quite exciting. So as I drop you in here to give you an example, and slow it down a little bit, right? Because that's the other thing that's really interesting about storytelling in this way. You can compress and elongate time, right? So you can speed things up or you can slow them down. So here's where folks are dropped into this. They get a quote about what grief is really like, because the piece is really about kind of navigating and being clouded by grief. So the aesthetic of the piece is really like you have to wayfind, and I kind of draw the lines almost like the lines in your hand, right? And so you start to move through this board, and you're doing it in a breakout room with other people, and you're finding things that maybe they haven't found, and they're leading you to different parts of the board. And as you come, there's like fragmented, kind of little sayings. His breath is labored, he's whispering, I lean closer. And then you're able to see like a little kind of experimental loop that sets a tone. These are actually some images that my dad made, and then I made art out of those actual stills. And then as you go, you start to realize it as branching kind of paths, right? Like, so this one's kind of talking about my dad being diagnosed the first time with cancer. He doesn't tell us. And then when I get down here, all of a sudden, wait, I can go this way. Up here is all about arson. This way is all about my dad's decline. And this way is about an enigma path. It's this weird kind of thing where I started to realize that my dad worked for the government and I never knew it, and all this really wild intrigue down that path. But as you move, you have the ability to kind of pull out things and investigate them and dig deeper into elements and uncover these different assets, see photographs that my father shot, make your way towards the actual fire itself, read what actually happened that day, sort through, various slides and images that are related to the blaze itself, and basically kind of move through this whole experience, right? And what you start to realize is there's more than you can ever do in this, right? And there are these beautiful moments where folks are able to, basically drop in and they're prompted, right? They'll read a journal entry, and here in the experience, people are asked to take a post-it note and complete the following statement: before I die. It becomes this beautiful tapestry of all the things that people want to do before they leave this mortal coil, right? And it has this powerful element where I'm now collaborating with the narrative medicine program at Columbia University, and we're using it as a way. It comes full circle. It's coming full circle. It's being used as a tool to help teach health practitioners and also patients and loved ones on how stories can be used for healing. And so I think what I found by using Miro as a tool to kind of tell these stories is this opportunity to challenge the notion of how a story is told. I love this quote by Godard, where he says, a story has a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily in that particular order, right? Like this idea that you could drop in anywhere, and the concurrent users in a space or audience members in a space is quite exciting, because if you leave room for them to discover things, which I think Miro is really great at, you can start to evolve the way in which you're creating a learning environment. So like, how can you think outside the box and embrace these elements of what you know within storytelling? Storytelling has a beginning, middle, and end, but then also, where do you leave room for the people to be able to discover elements and to bump into each other in interesting and dynamic ways, right? And so at the lab, we have a couple core principles that we use, that we design these spaces with. The first is the notion of a thematic frame. In both these pieces, they have themes, right? Project Immerse is kind of about a deep fake conspiratorial thriller, whereas Where There's Smoke is kind of about this idea of being clouded by grief. So they have themes. Themes help people to collaborate. They create a shared language for collaboration, so people can just jump right in. The second is this idea of a trace. Where can they see elements of themselves, right? And we've found that the more that they can see elements of themselves, the higher the engagement is, but also the more powerful the learning, right? The third is this idea of granting agency. A lot of our experiences play with this idea of agency for one versus many. We live, as I mentioned, in this many-to-many paradigm. We've found team sizes are most ideal between 4 and 6 people. If it's too small, it becomes dominant personalities take over. If it's too large, it's a consensus vortex and nobody can ever make a decision. So how can you actually move people in a dynamic way so they're doing something as an individual, then they're paired with people, then they're in a group, then they're back to an individual. So there's a real value in like thinking about the agency. And building upon that, the last step, which I think is fascinating, is this idea of serendipity management. This notion that you leave blank space in the experience that you create, in the sense that you allow people to bump into each other in unexpected ways. I would argue that a lot of digital work is overwrought and over-designed. What's amazing about prototyping and using Miro in this context is you can rapidly get to these great moments where things break, right? And you learn more from what breaks than what works. And so having these opportunities to kind of weave into your own work, the opportunity for people to bump into each other in unexpected ways, the creative sparks that fly from that are incredible. And the learning retention is amazing. So those are some ways that I kind of think about it in terms of how I'm designing these spaces, kind of approaching them and thinking about, this unique moment that we find ourselves in where stories are the same. It's the telling that's changing, right? And the telling with something like Miro is fundamentally like, I think it's a radical departure from how stories have classically worked, at least in the telling of those. But once again, the most important part is collaboration's at the key of this, because where there's smoke or Project Immerse do not happen without those formerly known as the audience. They are actually collaborators and storytellers, which is a fundamental shift in the way that we interact with media.
I really, thanks for sharing all of that and giving us a peek into the work that you're making. I really appreciate the term that you have, serendipity management. I don't know if I've thought of creative moments and ahas in that way, but I think it captures it really well. And the way that you can even see with where there's smoke. I think what I'm struck by is you're really thinking about how you're guiding the viewer with those, as you see those tendrils through the board in a very nonlinear way. And the viewer has to kind of learn to trust you and the confines of your story. And through that, then happen upon these nice moments, unexpected moments. And so I think it really speaks to how thoughtful you're being. And I think especially any facilitator, I think about this now of, even if I'm to host a meeting, how am I presenting information, whether it's a story or not, to visually to guide people through that and to enable them with the structure of that information to have those same moments. So I really appreciate that framing. So I wanted to just touch on a little bit how you think using Miro as a tool for your own creative ideation has maybe impacted the way that you think about creating and collaborating with others in the formation of these stories.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally a lot of the challenge has been a lot of the work that I do is very difficult to classify. So you have to kind of try to use words or a video that you've captured of what an installation is or an experience, and it takes a lot to set those things up. I've leaned into actually creating with Miro, and we've done Project Immerse where there's smoke. I use it in a large design thinking, speculative design futures course with high school students from all over the world. We're weaving it into our classrooms and designing really key kind of interesting interactions and collaborations between students and outside practitioners and folks who are from NGOs or whatnot. The thing that I think I take from it is a lot of the work that I would do would require so much time and effort to build something before it even got to the point of where an audience could interact with it. And I think fundamentally what I'm benefiting from in my own practice from Miro is the ability to bring the audience in even earlier than I ever was able to do before, right? And to treat them as actual collaborators in an environment and realize that that process is radically shifted in the sense of like what the path to kind of building an experience is accelerated. Like we do these really amazing burst collaborative kind of design sessions, right? Where we drop people into the experiences and we really think about like their journey through it. And then we look and we say, okay, what was that like? And we were able to record how they moved through it. We're able to kind of look at the data points from it, both in terms of what we chose to start as an initial activity or how we collected data throughout it. So we do a lot in our work that makes use of data collection, right? And then we take that and we think about what do we hope somebody's thinking or feeling while they're doing something in the experience. And then we look and we say, what were they really thinking, feeling while they were doing those things, right? And we start to use it more as a prototyping and design tool earlier on in the process. It's kind of almost like a 21st century writer's room, right? Like when I've worked in television and film, you'll be at times, you'll be collaborating with other writers. Here we're doing it where it's kind of a writer's room that's using rich media, that's pulling from the web, that's able to, make use of attention within the board and move people to different places. We've started to shape and create a grammar. Like if I go down and I use the map, we'll jump to different parts, and that's like a jump cut. Or we'll use the zoom in, zoom out as like a zoom, like within cinema. Or we'll use the attention management to do like a pan, or to transport somebody else to a different part of the board. I think when you start to think of the tool in creative ways, or in a way where you start to think about it as an experience, it kind of opens up the possibilities. And I see this over and over again with when my students land in it, they start doing initial things. But then when I start to share some of the work and then we start to go, they build these amazing experiences, right? But if they looked at the tool on the surface, they would think that it only had one potential application: collaboration around design practice. But what we do is we kind of pull that back and say, yeah, that's a great part of the process. But what if we actually told stories through this tool? Right? Like what if we use the affordances and constraints? So I'd say it's radically shifted some of the ways that I'm thinking about collaboration and storytelling.
That's great. And one final question to close things out. I'm wondering if you have any advice for those that might not be professional storytellers in the room and on the call, for how to take what would be the one thing you would tell anybody with any kind of role that's maybe hosting some kind of online group connection? Maybe it's a video call. What's one piece of advice you would leave with them to change the way that they're thinking about forging creative collaboration?
Well, I would say fundamentally, like, test and break it as much as possible. Move away from assumptions. Right? Like a lot of times people will design something and they'll think that it has to be by that design. Like the best facilitation comes from an understanding of being flexible, knowing when to keep it tight and when to let it be loose. Right? And I would challenge people to kind of just prototype some of those things in those interactions. But the ideal thing is, how can you build something that leaves somebody with a story, that when they leave that experience, they tell someone else about it? That something happened and it shifted for them. Like there's a wonderful theater piece called Sleep No More, where you kind of go through it and it's Macbeth meets like Hitchcock, and it's in like 101 rooms in a hotel, and you all follow different actors, right? And you make your way through this world. But the part that I always find that's the strongest is afterwards, when you talk about it and you say, what did you see? And somebody says, I saw this, I was here. And somebody's like, I never saw that. Where was that? Miro has the same ability, right? Like, how can you allow people to find the learning, not necessarily where you're always, basically telling them. So it's like show, don't tell, right? I would say that's the biggest thing.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much for your time, Lance. It was great to chat with you. I hope everybody here found this as inspiring and just sort of jaw-dropping to see Miro used in this way. At least I know I do. So I'm really excited to see sort of more stories that you're telling, Lance, and more projects that come out of your work. So thank you.
Thank you very much.